There is no crime more evil or disturbing than the rape of a child. After the sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl, Montgomery County Police found themselves in a desperate race to stop a dangerous pedophile before he struck again. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
Veteran detectives David Allen Hutchinson and Jim Beasley of the Montgomery County Police Department have investigated hundreds of sexual assaults.
Jim, I think we got another one.
Detective Hutchinson and I became involved in the investigation of a rape involving a 15-year-old victim in the Aspen Hill area of Montgomery County. The victim reported to the police that around 10:30, 11 o'clock, she was alone at home in her residence when she was grabbed from behind by a person who was already in the house. She was blindfolded and gagged and then removed from her house by this assailant. He took her to a car and then transported her to another residence.
Where are you taking me?
Where he sexually assaulted her and then returned her to the general area of her home.
She was extremely traumatized by this event, as any would be. I mean, she was at tender years of 15, but she turned out to be a very good witness and a very gutsy young lady.
Maria, is there anything you can tell us?
She was able to tell us the approximate age, height.
There was something different about the way he spoke.
She focused in on the fact that he may have had some sort of speech impediment because he had a very, very distinctive voice. During the interview with this young lady, she offered us a lot of details, but nothing that would immediately identify this person. So we knew we were up against a very, very difficult case.
4 months later, 38-year-old Julie Marcus got out of her car to look for the address of an Aspen Hill friend.
She was grabbed from behind by a person who tackled her, threw her to the ground. She was sexually assaulted, and before the assailant left, he took her purse.
Although this victim was more than 20 years older than the last, the description of the rapist was identical.
Based on this particular case and a number of other cases, Detective Beasley and myself determined that this was probably the work of a serial rapist.
A search of the case file showed that he might have committed up to 22 separate attacks in the previous 2 years. All but 5 of his victims were under the age of 18.
The media attention that was focused on the Aspen Hill area was extremely intense.
We're doing everything we can, ma'am.
Our office received a barrage of phone calls every day. Everyone was naturally clamoring for information. When was the police going to arrest this person? There was a lot of focus on it, and rightfully so. I mean, people were very concerned, very fearful for themselves and their children.
A special task force consisting of more than 50 officers was formed to identify and capture the Aspen Hill rapist. Detective Sergeant Jim Arnold supervised the operation.
The first 2 weeks involved deploying the surveillance team into the Aspen Hill area. We did such mundane things as sit there and record every tag number that came in and out of the street at night. We looked for suspects that fit the general description, which was a white male, early 20s, which fit just about everybody, not only on the street that we saw, but every police officer in the neighborhood also.
But police weren't the only ones on the lookout for the rapist.
The general feeling in the community at that time was, I guess if you had a younger girl, daughter, was panic, concern, slight vigilantism. And I recall one gentleman whose daughter was a victim used to go out every night and walk the streets with a baseball bat.
Public awareness of the case produced hundreds of tips from concerned citizens. But despite round-the-clock efforts by the task force, daily media bombardment, and intense community vigilance, the people of Aspen Hill lived in fear, not knowing if or when the rapist would strike again.
For 18 months, an elusive serial rapist struck at will throughout Aspen Hill, an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. A special police task force was formed, and the media saturated the airwaves, asking for the public's help. Within weeks, investigators received a vital clue from an unlikely source.
Captain Bill O'Toole was a rookie detective assigned to the task force.
My particular role was that of the case file coordinator. There was to be one person, and I was that person, who was going to handle every lead that came in, every name, every location, every license plate number, to funnel it into one place, put it on 3x5 cards so that we could look for repeat names or tag numbers as we tried to develop leads and suspects in this case.
Amid the flurry of leads, Officer O'Toole received a phone call from a concerned citizen that seemed to stand out from all the others.
How long ago did this happen?
The first lead that would eventually lead us to a very strong suspect was a call from a woman who lived in a nearby community who recalled a case where a young girl had been walking home and was grabbed from behind by an assailant.
The suspected attacker was apprehended a few blocks away.
We were able to check from the police reports that there was a person by the name of Timothy Joseph Busby who was in fact detained by Montgomery County police officers for the possibility that he had confronted and robbed this young victim.
Timothy Busby was a local land surveyor and devoted father of two.
She recognized him as a visitor to another family in her neighborhood, and she told us that that family had included two police officers from our department.
Busby had been friends with one of the officers since childhood. The officer was brought in for questioning.
Back in high school, I remember Tim telling me, like, look in windows while women were undressing.
We learned that during the period of time when Timothy Busby was growing up, he seemed to display a lot of interest in being a peeping Tom. That certainly heightened our interest in Timothy Busby at that point.
From that moment on, Timothy Busby never left their sight.
Once we developed the primary suspect, who was Busby, we were doing surveillance on him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Stayed with him all day wherever he went.
We had about 30, 40 special assignment team members flooding that neighborhood, watching Busby go down street after street after street. He would peek in windows, go in backyards. These special assignment team members had to go with him. They went into adjacent yards and watched him look in windows to make sure he didn't go in. It was amazing that they were never observed.
On one particular instance, we actually watched him follow a 12-year-old girl in a parochial uniform, watch her go into a home, hang around for a while, actually go up to the front porch of the house, look through the window, go down the side of the house and peer into windows. You have sheer terror in your heart. It's a panic. I mean, in one sense, you're feeling jubilant because you know you've got the right guy, and yet on the other sense is how far do you let him go before you have to stop him? So you don't want to do anything premature, and yet you can't let him hurt someone else.
Investigators needed something to link Busby to the attacks, but none of the victims had seen the attacker's face. Their only hope of identifying him was the 15-year-old girl who remembered his voice.
We set up a voice identification lineup over telephone where we contacted several surveyors.
This is Timothy. How can I help you?
Timothy Busby's company was the 8th call they made.
From my house. Could you help me?
It's him.
The victim's response was immediate and positive.
Timothy Busby was arrested exiting his place of business in Gaithersburg. He was subsequently taken into custody by myself, Detective Beasley, driven to Rockville for the purpose of interview and processing. We had another team at his place of business that was conducting a search warrant on those premises. During the course of that search, we were notified that a credit card in the name of the 38-year-old victim, which had been stolen during her assault, was located in the office.
But that wasn't all. In another drawer, they found a bag stuffed with women's underwear. Detectives were confident that the Aspen Hill rapist's 2-year reign of terror had finally come to an end, but they couldn't really be sure until he had been convicted in a court of law.
The sexual predator who police believed had terrorized an entire community for more than a year was finally behind bars. Although authorities believe Timothy Busby may have committed as many as 16 rapes, prosecutors chose to focus on 2 of the attacks. The ensuing trials brought to light the anguish and shame suffered by the victims of sexual assault.
Assistant State's Attorney Barry Hamilton was a prosecutor in the Major Offenders Bureau in Montgomery County when the Aspen Hill rape cases went to trial.
The strategy was to try to put together a case that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the person who committed each of these individual crimes. Our problem was we couldn't just lump them all together.
Forced to try the cases separately, the prosecution of Timothy Busby began with the rape of 15-year-old Mary Covington.
Our biggest problem in that case was that the victim was going to be very difficult to present on the stand. She was young, obviously horribly traumatized by this. What had happened to her was not eager in any way, shape, or form to recount it.
Would you please tell the court what the defendant did to you?
The courtroom fell silent as Mary Covington tried to describe her ordeal.
I can't. I'm sorry, I just can't.
The victim was then unable to articulate what specifically had happened to her. She was able to recount the facts of the abduction. When it came down to describing the sex acts that were committed on her, she couldn't do it.
I can't talk about it.
And we had to figure out what to do, and fortunately came up with the idea of having her write it, which she said she thought she could do. It was very brief, but it satisfied the legal requirements.
Next, prosecutors presented the tape-recorded voice lineup.
This is Timothy. How can I help you?
Do you recognize the voice on the tape, Miss Covington? Your Honor, let the record show that the witness has identified...
The prosecution sealed their case with a positive identification of Busby's voice. The defense case centered on what it claimed was a lack of evidence.
This case will not be tried in the court of public opinion.
The defense strategy was to attack each of the component parts of the state's case. First, to try to destroy them or weaken them as much as possible, and then to go on and say, even if these are so, they don't add up to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
After 8 days, both prosecution and defense rested their cases. It took the jury just 4 hours to come back with a verdict. They found the defendant guilty. Sentencing was held over until prosecutors presented the second Aspen Hill rape case. This time, the defense chose to forego a jury and try the case before a judge. A new lawyer now joined the prosecution, Assistant State's Attorney Robert Dean.
There was a considerable chance that we would not sustain our proof in the case. We knew that going in, and we knew it doubly when it was a court trial, because we knew that this judge held the state to a very high standard.
He was a predator, Your Honor. He stalked her.
The bulk of the prosecution's case was based on a single, potent piece of evidence.
Then he stole the victim's credit card.
We did have a smoking gun, which was the victim's credit card. that was found in Busby's desk at his surveying office.
The prosecution showed how Busby had used the card to make several purchases. Next, prosecutors admitted the credit card receipts into evidence and called an FBI handwriting expert to the stand.
The FBI examined handwriting samples that we obtained from Busby and compared them with the fake signatures on the credit card receipts.
And what is your further analysis of his credit card?
Although the handwriting expert could not confirm an absolute match, there was something about one of the receipts that was even more incriminating. At first glance, the signature looked like a scribble.
It wasn't until midway through the trial that it became apparent to everyone involved in the case that the scribble was quite simply two signatures, one over the other. It was the victim's name that he had written over his own name, Timothy Busby. It was a devastating discovery.
Your Honor, this is outrageous.
The defense attorney obviously was not pleased.
I demand a mistrial.
I suspect he felt that we had sandbagged him. We didn't. It was as much as a surprise to us as it was to him. He wanted a mistrial. He was not given a mistrial. The judge gave him several days, I believe it was over the weekend, to respond to this new evidence. When we resumed the trial, there wasn't much the defense attorney could do, and the case became a very strong case.
After 6 days of testimony, the prosecution and defense rested their cases, and the judge retired to his chambers to make a decision. In the end, the judge found Timothy Busby guilty of first-degree rape, robbery, and kidnapping in the case of Julie Marcus.
We were very pleased to have evidence basically improve in the middle of trial, which does not happen very often. That's why this case is so memorable. We were very satisfied because it basically ensured that Timothy Busby was going to remain in prison for a long period of time.
I'd describe Timothy Busby as a sexual predator and a person who caused great harm to many, many people.
Ultimately, Timothy Busby was sentenced to 4 concurrent life terms plus 50 years.
Although she initially supported her husband, Timothy Busby's wife eventually came to the same conclusions as the jury and judge in his trials. Shortly after his convictions, she filed for divorce.